Hi guys, so I'm finally back today and we're gonna do some distillation. Last time I made a corn wash for us to distill into moonshine. But in case you haven't seen it, no worries, this process is pretty general, and you can also use it to turn wine into brandy or anything else you can think of. As I said last time, distillation is the process of trying to separate out one liquid from another. In our case, we're trying to separate alcohol and water from a bunch of other stuff that's in the corn wash. Well, what other stuff? When yeast makes alcohol, it also makes a bunch of other things too. Some of the stuff, such as methyl alcohol, can give you a really bad headache / hangovers, and also there's some other more nefarious stuff in there as well. The cool thing is that all of these separate components of the wash have different boiling points. So we can use this fact to separate them out. We can heat up the liquid, turning some of the components into gas, cool them back down, turning them back into liquid. As the liquid gains more energy, different components will evaporate and then condense, allowing us to actually physically separate them. Now this isn't the full picture, but we'll get more into it as we go on. So let's pick up where we left off last time. So after about a week, my corn wash was done, and it's not exactly the prettiest stuff in the world as you can see, but it'll do. I filtered the stuff out into a sanitized glass jug and measured out that it had a final alcohol percentage of something around 5%, which is actually pretty low. I think this is because last time I didn't do a great job of converting the starches into sugar, and you can see this based on the fact that it's so cloudy, but oh well, I still was able to get some moonshine out of the end, albeit not much. So with that being said, let's get started on the actual distilling. Well, the first thing we're going to do is something known as a stripping run, which actually sounds like the world's most fun marathon, but in reality it's actually sort of a pre-distillation distillation. It'll help us separate the starches, sugar, and some of the water from the alcohol. It's also kind of nice because if you're new to distillation, the stripping run is kind of easy, and it'll give you a sense of how distillation works, but kind of in a lower pressure environment. Now this thing here is my still. It's more of a lab still instead of the typical moonshiner copper still you may have seen before, but it still works just fine. I was able to get mine online for around 30 euros, and I should also state that I'm limited to a 500 milliliter still for legal reasons, but if you're not bound by legality, this method should still work for bigger stills as well. So for the stripping run, all we do is heat the liquid in this container. As it heats up, some of it will evaporate, traveling up to this point here, where we can measure the average temperature of the evaporated liquid. And it kind of is forced down to this side, which is a condenser. Now the condenser has two walls, an inner wall that the gas can travel through, and an outer wall that I pump with cool water using an aquarium pump. The hot gas interacts with the water-cooled glass and recondenses back into a liquid. The liquid is then collected into a container, and by monitoring the temperature of the evaporated gas, we can get a sense of which chemical is actually coming out and which one we're evaporating at that moment. So before we actually start distilling, I just have some quick tips for safety. It's really crucial that you work in a space that's well ventilated. Breathing alcohol gas can be dangerous, and so make sure you have fresh air. Especially because if you're working with a glass still like I am, it's going to smell pretty bad. Something like wet dog. Tip 2, boilovers can happen and a bunch of other stuff, so it's always a good idea to keep an eye on your still. So for the stripping run, all we need to do now is just heat the liquid and monitor the temperature. That's basically it. We're going to let this thing go, making sure that we are pumping cool water through the condenser and collecting everything that comes out of the condenser until our steam reaches an average temperature about 90 degrees Celsius. And this is basically it. This is the result after my first stripping run. You can see that the liquid that I've collected here is much clearer. This stuff is what's known as the low wines. And you might also notice that in comparison to the other side where we were boiling, there frankly isn't much liquid here. The reason for that is because there's not much alcohol in my wash, and hopefully it's a problem you don't have. To extract all of it, I had to repeat the process several times just due to the size of my still. Once I collected all of the low wines from my still, I was able to measure that it was around 30% alcoholic and had collected about 400 milliliters from the 8 liters of wash that I had initially made last time. So the next step is we're going to actually turn these low wines into our final product. And to do this, we're going to be a little bit more picky and try to sort out the individual components left behind in our wine. The main problem lay in the fact that each component has a different boiling point, and at any given moment, the evaporated liquid is actually a combination of the components, meaning that although we may be at 80 degrees Celsius, we still have some components of ethanol, some components of water, some components of methanol, and this has to do with how the energy is distributed chemically. Basically, it means that we cannot 100% separate out each component cleanly. It will always be a blend of the other chemicals contained in the initial liquid. However, we can roughly separate these sections into categories, known as the foreshots, the heads, the hearts, and the tails. There are a bunch of resources out there on how to collect and blend various parts, but for the most part, I want this video to be simple, and so I'm only going to focus on collecting the hearts, which is to say the part that is mostly ethanol. I'll try to include some resources in the description if you want to learn more on maybe how to blend, but that's beyond the scope of this video. One way to actually help us get better separation so we have less of the other stuff and we can kind of separate the ethanol from the other chemicals is to use something what's known as a reflux column. Now, a reflux column is the chemical equivalent to a prism. It'll help us make it so that the chemicals that we receive at the output are more distinct and separated better. It works by the fact that as the mixture of gases comes up, gases in this mixture with higher boiling points are more prone to recondense on the glass walls or the copper inside of the reflux column, whereas gases that have a lower boiling point can pass through. You can kind of think about it the way that each chemical kind of waits for its partner. So instead of a constant stream of changing blended alcohols, you get something more like a distinct burst of more separated, homogeneous outputs. Additionally, another reason I packed copper into the center was that it reacts with sulfur compounds, and this stuff is partially what's responsible for the wet dog smell. So if you're using a copper pot still, you shouldn't have this problem. Alright, so now we're ready for the actual distillation. With our reflux column in place, we can begin. Start by heating the low wines in our boiling vessel, and after a few minutes, the steam should reach an average temperature at around 65 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees F. At this point, we should be getting our first vapors condensing. Now these vapors are bad. The stuff that boils at these lowest temperature are known as the four shots, which contain methanol and acetone, two things we really don't want to consume. So just simply throw this stuff out. So anything that comes after the four shots is what's known as the heads. So the heads contain alcohol, but they contain other stuff as well, maybe stuff we really don't want to drink. So adjust the temperature of the burner so that the steam stays at a constant temperature of 75 degrees Celsius, below the boiling point of ethanol. Hold it here for a few minutes, and this will allow us to boil off all of the stuff with a lower boiling point than alcohol. After a few minutes, you should notice that we don't have any more output from the still. So as long as you were holding it at 75 degrees Celsius, we know that we've boiled off all the head. Now we raise the heat again, and at this point, anything that comes out of the still should be the hearts, and we want to collect it, because it's the good stuff. It's kind of a wise idea to split off everything into separate containers after every 25 milliliters or so. This will kind of allow you to make sure that you don't mix in tails in with your hearts. So at some point, we'll stop collecting hearts and we'll be collecting what's known as tails. And you'll know this because it'll start to smell kind of not as nice as the other stuff, kind of more like wet dog. It won't taste good if you take a small taste of it, and also be a little bit cloudy. Now this stuff doesn't taste so good. Although it has a lot of alcohol left in it, you probably don't want to drink it. So it's a good idea maybe to just stop here, and you can kind of repeat this process and collect more and more alcohol. But I was kind of satisfied with what I got. At this point, we can collect our hearts, measure out the alcohol content, and for mine I was somewhere around 70%, which I then added filtered water to get more palatable alcohol content of around 40%. And that's it! We have Moonshine, so please enjoy it safely, and keep in mind that I'm not an expert, and this video just kind of scratches the surface of all the really cool things there are to know about distilling. If you enjoyed this and you want to start distilling, be sure to watch several videos and kind of get a sense of what works for you. Thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Lastly, I really want to apologize for the delay. I've been super busy at work these days, and hopefully I can carve out some more time for pumping out these videos. Anyways, bye!